They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. But I'll tell you what, hell's got nothing on a blonde with a clipboard and an HOA badge. You'd think after 30 years on the bench, presiding over drug cartels, corporate fraud rings, and murder trials, I'd have seen every kind of manipulation there is. But no, nothing prepared me for the day I was arrested on my own damn ranch because my grass dared to grow half an inch too high. She called the cops on me. Not a citation, not a fine taped to the mailbox. Actual police, 911 emergency services, because I dared to step foot onto my property wearing jeans with a hole in the knee and boots scuffed by real work. And the part that really twists the knife? She live-streamed it, called me a vagrant, a threat to society. She measured my grass with a damn ruler like I was hiding nuclear codes in there. It was a Saturday morning in Austin, Texas. Cold air, quiet roads, radio humming George Strait. I was driving my '94 Ford pickup, a beast with more heart than paint, heading to the ranch where I spent most weekends fixing up the barn, trimming the pecan trees, and sitting in silence that didn't ask anything of me. The kind of peace you only earn after a lifetime of other people's noise. My coffee steamed in the cup holder. My bones ached the way they do now, reliably reminding me that 47 is no longer young, but not yet old enough to sit still. Then I saw her, Lydia Bennett, bent over at my gate in her designer leggings like she was posing for a Pilates ad. Except she had a ruler in hand and a face twisted with something between indignation and glee. I slowed down, rolled down the window, and forced civility through my clenched teeth. "Good morning, Lydia," I said, trying not to let the coffee burn in my gut turn into something louder. She spun around like a gunslinger in yoga gear, hair perfectly curled, makeup already set at 8 a.m., and that damn ruler waving like a sword. "Don't you good morning me, Evan Harper," she screeched, like I'd personally offended the Constitution. "This grass is 3.5 inches tall. Willowbrook HOA regulations clearly state 2 inches maximum." I stared at her for a beat, took a long, slow sip of coffee. My property is 40 years older than the HOA. Her subdivision didn't even exist when I bought this land. I told her that calmly, reasonably, like I'd told her 5 times before. But reason was like gasoline on her fire. Her face turned crimson to match her nails, and that's when the phone came out. She started filming, not casually, like she was auditioning for Real Housewives. HOA edition. "Ladies and gentlemen," she narrated, "I am here at the gate of what can only be described as a blight on our beautiful community. This vagrant refuses to comply with basic neighborhood standards." That was the moment something old stirred in me. Not rage, not even insult, just the heavy, slow awakening of a man who's had enough. I stepped out of the truck. My boots crunched on the gravel. She stiffened. "Lydia," I said, voice low, steady, "step aside. I need to access my land." Her chin lifted like she thought she was guarding the nuclear codes. "Not until you agree to comply with HOA standards," she snapped. "This affects all of us." Then she did it. She dialed 911, told them a suspicious male was trying to force entry onto private property, called me aggressive, dangerous, old clothes, beat-up truck. Must be a drifter, not a judge. She smirked at me the whole time. She thought she'd won. When Deputy Ryan Foster rolled up 10 minutes later, his cruiser dusted with frost, I saw it in his eyes, recognition and exhaustion. This wasn't his first Lydia call. "Ma'am, sir, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, though I think he already knew. She launched into a dramatic tirade about community standards and neighborhood threats. I waited, arms crossed. When she finally stopped for breath, I spoke. "Deputy, this is my property. Ms. Bennett is blocking my access." Ryan asked for ID. I handed him my driver's license. He glanced at it, and I saw the shift behind his badge. Judge Evan Harper, federal. His jaw tightened, but he stayed professional. "Judge Harper, I apologize for the inconvenience." Then he turned to Lydia. "Ma'am, this gentleman owns this land. You need to step aside." She gawked like someone had slapped her with a fish. "Judge? That's impossible. Look at him. Look at that truck." But she moved, grudgingly, still recording, still snarling. As I opened my gate, she hissed, "This isn't over, Harper. The HOA has ways of dealing with people like you." I didn't reply. Didn't need to. The barn needed patching. The peace needed reclaiming. But I couldn't shake it. 20 minutes of my morning, hijacked. My right to walk through my own damn gate turned into a circus. And as the sun climbed above the mesquites, my phone buzzed. Email from Lydia. Urgent neighborhood menace update. She'd sent the video out to every neighbor, complete with screenshots of my truck, close-ups of my grass, captions like, "refuses to maintain property," and aggressive toward concerned residents. Her tone was righteous. Her reach was long. But what came next turned annoyance into a war declaration. An hour later, a certified letter arrived, hand-delivered by a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Inside, a formal violation notice from Willowbrook HOA, a $300 fine, failure to maintain property, public disturbance, official letterhead, official language, except I don't belong to the HOA. Never have. This place predates their covenant by decades. I crumpled the letter, smoothed it again, read every line. Then I walked to my desk, pulled out a legal pad, and wrote at the top, "Bennett versus Harper, evidence log." I called Brandon Carter, my legal assistant. "Clear your Monday, Brandon. We've got work to do." You see, Lydia made a critical mistake. She looked at an old truck and saw weakness. She saw rust on a gate and assumed decay. She saw silence and mistook it for surrender. But she forgot something important. I may have left the bench to seek peace, but I spent 3 decades building cases that stuck, arguments that shredded deception, cross-examinations that left grown men trembling. She poked a man who'd buried drug lords in federal courtrooms. She dragged me out of retirement with a damn ruler. The next morning, word spread like fire. Lydia had called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda? Community standards and adjacent property threats. She was proposing a resolution to annex my land, expand HOA jurisdiction to unsightly neighboring properties. I showed up that night, didn't speak, sat in the back watching. 60 or so residents, most confused, some annoyed, all watching Lydia strut to the podium like she was announcing a crusade. "This eyesore," she said, flashing a photo of my gate on the projector, "sits at our front entrance. Visitors see this before they see our beautiful homes." She even had a mock-up of my gate repainted white with decorative ironwork. It was theater, self-righteous, deluded, dangerous theater. One of my actual neighbors, Margaret Sullivan, timidly raised a hand. "But isn't that property outside our jurisdiction?" Lydia's smile was sharp enough to bleed. "Currently, yes, but I propose we extend our covenant. For everyone's benefit." The room buzzed. Uneasy. No resolution was passed. But the threat hung heavy in the air. Lydia wasn't just playing HOA president. She was building a regime. The next day, a new threat. An anonymous letter under my door. HOA letterhead. No signature. "Consider this a neighborly warning. Things can become very uncomfortable for those who don't fit in." The message was clear. Comply or be crushed. I showed it to Brandon. "This is criminal," he said. "But we'll need more." By midweek, Margaret showed up at my office, hands trembling. "Judge Harper," she said quietly. "I kept everything." She handed over emails, fines, photos. She fined me $200 for roses that clashed with her color scheme. Said they were pinker than HOA guidelines allowed. Margaret's voice shook. "But when I saw what she's doing to you, I had to come forward." I thanked her, promised discretion, and added her documentation to the growing file. The shape of the war was becoming clear. Lydia didn't just hate tall grass. She hated autonomy. She punished independence. She ruled through fear. But she forgot the golden rule of bullies. Never pick a fight with someone who's been quiet too long. Someone who's already done their fighting in courtrooms where the stakes were higher than a lawn. This was no longer about grass. It never was. This was about control, property, identity. And Lydia Bennett, in all her manicured righteousness, had just kicked a hornet's nest. one covered in federal case law and sharpened by decades of cross-examination. And she had no idea what was coming next. Monday came hard and early, but not harder than the knock at my door. It wasn't Brandon or a neighbor or the postman, it was a landscaping crew. 5 men in neon vests and caps, unloading commercial-grade mowers like they were about to manicure Augusta. On my ranch. My land. I stepped onto the porch in my robe and boots, coffee still in hand, and waved them down. The crew chief, young guy with a clipboard, looked up. "We're here for the HOA work order," he said. All cheerful like this was a suburban cul-de-sac. Owner approved. Routine compliance cleanup. My eyebrows lifted before my voice did. "Son," I said, slowly walking toward him, "what address is on that order?" He read it out loud. My exact property. My exact name. And bold at the bottom, authorized by Lydia Bennett. She'd forged approval for a private crew to trespass, mow down what she called nuisance growth, but what I'd been cultivating as a native wildflower barrier for pollinators. Years of work, chopped down in minutes because Queen Lydia decided my land didn't fit her vision board. I didn't raise my voice. I just told them calmly this was illegal and asked them to leave. They did, but not before slicing a swath through my eastern meadow that looked like a strip mall lawn. That afternoon, a bill arrived. $500 for emergency HOA remediation services. Sent by Lydia. No warning, no vote, just a post-it note with payment due immediately. I stared at it long and hard, then laid it gently on the evidence pile that was beginning to resemble a war archive. Brandon showed up right after sunset, laptop under one arm, eyes bright like he'd just cracked a cold case. "You need to see this," he said without even sitting down. He pulled up HOA records, public if you know where to look. "You remember Edith Ramsey?" he asked. I did. Sweet woman, used to bake lemon bars for board meetings. Died in 2019. Stroke. Brandon nodded. "Well, apparently she's been busy since." He pulled up a financial statement from 2020. Signature, Edith Ramsey, treasurer. Another from 2021. Same name, same neat cursive. But she'd been dead for over a year by then. The smoking gun wasn't the signatures, it was what they approved. Landscaping payments. To a company owned by Lydia's cousin. Monthly overcharges, inflated invoices, kickbacks disguised as maintenance. 3 years. $47,000. Approved by a ghost. And who stepped in as HOA president the same month Edith's obituary ran in the paper? Lydia Bennett. This wasn't neighborhood pride. This was embezzlement dressed in beige cardigans and manicured hedges. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, God no. I've seen men break down in courtrooms over real stakes, prison time, life sentences. But this was rage. Pure, tight rage wrapped in politeness and HOA language. She wasn't just threatening property anymore. She was perverting the law itself. And I'd given my life to that law. The next morning, the circus resumed. A teen from the neighborhood had tagged me in a video. Lydia, in broad daylight, leading what she called a community standards march. It was 15 people. Most of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, chanting 2 inches max, and carrying signs about visual harmony. One had a sign that just said, "Grass equals decay." At my gate, someone had spray painted "Hick Get Out" in neon green. She stood there like a prophet, clutching a megaphone, barking HOA codes like scripture. It would have been funny if it weren't so goddamn insane. Ryan Foster was already there, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Morning, Judge," he muttered as I walked up, coffee in hand, same robe, same boots. Nice complaint. His tone said it all. "God save me from Ms. Bennett." He turned to her. "Ma'am, it's 7 a.m. This constitutes noise disturbance." She raged about First Amendment rights and environmental decay. I just sipped coffee and watched. Then something surprising happened. Margaret Sullivan, timid, soft-spoken Margaret, stepped out from the crowd. "Lydia, this is ridiculous," she said. "You fined me for having roses that were the wrong shade of pink. Now you're targeting Judge Harper because his grass grows too wild." Lydia's face turned sharp and cold. Margaret, I'd be careful if I were you. I still have that unresolved complaint about your garden gnome. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. One of the younger residents snorted. You fined the Johnson kids for chalk drawings, he muttered. On their own driveway. The dam cracked. Not fully, but enough to let truth start leaking through. Lydia's grip was weakening. Back at the ranch, I met with Brandon again. He'd uncovered more old board meeting notes altered after the fact, records purged from public files. But the big find came in the form of a complaint Lydia filed with the city planning office. Official looking, HOA letterhead, claimed multiple code violations on my land. Fence disrepair, rusted gate, oil leaks. The complaint was signed, Edith Ramsey, dated just last week. That's when I realized we were beyond neighborhood politics. Lydia wasn't just faking authority. She was resurrecting the dead to weaponize them. Margaret returned that evening, this time with 2 other neighbors in tow. They came in quietly, shoulders hunched, like people used to being told to sit down and shut up. They brought more stories, arbitrary fines, retaliatory inspections, late-night compliance checks. Margaret showed me a video on her phone, grainy but clear audio. Lydia's voice, sharp as glass. If you don't comply, Margaret, I will make your life so difficult you'll wish you'd never moved here. She wasn't keeping the neighborhood safe. She was running a personal fiefdom. Brandon compiled everything into a timeline, digital and physical. Complaints, letters, forged documents, unauthorized financial transfers. It wasn't just enough to defend my land anymore. This needed to end, for everyone. And yet, just when I thought we'd seen it all, Lydia escalated again. An email blast, this time to local news. Subject line, Federal Judge Abuses Power to Intimidate HOA. Inside were bizarre allegations, bribery, harassment, tampering with community records. It was laughable, until Brandon called. She's saying she has security footage, he said, voice taut, of you tampering with HOA files. I froze, because I knew where this was going. It wasn't real footage. Couldn't be. And it wasn't. It was a deepfake. Badly done, lazy transitions, my voice pieced together from a public talk at a civic center 5 years ago. The audio said things I'd never said. The video showed me handing over envelopes, grainy and shaky, like a B-movie trying to be a thriller. And it didn't matter, because it looked just real enough to plant doubt, to make noise, to make my name trend on local message boards. Federal judge framed by HOA president might sound like satire, but to people reading headlines, it was sensational enough to stick. That night, I walked the fence line, the part they hadn't mowed yet, the part still wild and whispering with native grass and the scent of mesquite. I thought about my father, World War II vet, blue collar, no nonsense. He used to say, "Son, never let anyone rent space in your head for free." Lydia had set up a whole damn condo complex. But now I knew what I had to do. This wasn't a personal feud anymore. It was a battle for truth. For law. For every man who ever got fined for a truck that looked too old, for a flag too faded, for a shed too honest to pass their visual standards. I wasn't just going to shut her down. I was going to expose everything. Every lie, every forged page, every petty tyranny. And I'd do it the same way I always had. Methodically, legally, without shouting. Just facts, evidence, truth. And one hell of a closing argument. Because Lydia Bennett had made the same mistake every tyrant makes. She underestimated the man who'd spent a lifetime letting others talk first. Now it was my turn. Thursday broke with a strange calm. The kind that settles over you when a storm's been circling but hasn't landed. Yet, I stood by my porch with my 3rd cup of black coffee, boots grounded in red Texas dirt, watching the morning sun cut through the mist above my uncut fields. The silence was broken by the buzz of my phone, Brandon's name lighting up the screen. "We've got a problem," he said without ceremony, his voice tense. "Lydia's gone federal. She's filed a complaint with the Judicial Review Board." I took a slow breath, not because I was surprised, but because I knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't a neighborhood fight anymore. This was a calculated attempt to ruin everything I'd built across 3 decades of federal service. She's alleging you accepted bribes to rule favorably on land use cases. Brandon continued, and I could hear his keyboard clacking in the background. She included scanned bank statements. That froze me. And Evan, they look real. My jaw tightened. Fake evidence, fabricated deposits, doctored timelines. It was digital forgery at its most insidious. I asked him to forward everything and hung up. Within 10 minutes, I had the documents in front of me. My bank account numbers, legitimate addresses, my signature, transaction histories. Only they weren't mine. The statements listed mysterious $5,000 and $10,000 deposits on dates I was supposedly ruling on zoning applications. The problem? I was either in court on unrelated cases or hundreds of miles away on judicial business. But to someone looking for a scandal, it could appear damning. I didn't even have time to digest the implications before the second call came. The chief judge, his voice was gruff, no nonsense. "Evan," he said, "you've got enemies." I replied simply, "Yes, and one of them has too much time on her hands and no respect for the truth." He sighed. "We're opening an investigation. You know the drill." I did. God help me, I'd initiated similar probes myself on less evidence. By noon, legal blogs had caught wind. Headlines like "Federal Judge Under Bribery Cloud" and "HOA Scandal Deepens with Accusations Against Jurist" started cropping up. My name, which had once stood for quiet integrity and consistent fairness, was now smeared across digital mud like I was some political appointee with skeletons in the trunk of my old Ford. I spent the afternoon in my study, blinds drawn, evidence spread across my desk like a war map. Lydia had made her boldest move yet, one that could end me. But she didn't count on two things. One, I've spent my life unraveling lies. And two, she's not as smart as she thinks she is. Because just after 5 o'clock, Brandon came charging in with a revelation that lit the fuse on her carefully laid plan. "She messed up," he said, breathless, waving his laptop. "She CC'd me." I blinked. "What?" He pulled up an email thread. She was coordinating with a tech guy to create the fake statements. Somewhere in the back and forth, she replied all instead of replying directly. And I was still looped in from when I'd posed as a compliance officer last month. I read the emails. Her words, clear as daylight. "Make sure the deposits match these dates. I don't care what it costs. Harper needs to pay." She paid the guy $15,000 via crypto, included instructions, examples, even a list of rulings she wanted tied to the transactions. My eyes narrowed. "This is enough to bury her." Brandon grinned. "I already forwarded it to the authorities. And Evan, there's more." He clicked open a payment receipt. She also commissioned a video, a deepfake, paid a college student $3,500 to stitch together clips of you taking envelopes. It's laughably bad, but she was going to send it to the press. I stared at the evidence, a cocktail of disgust and calm fury rising in my gut. She turned to fraud, forgery, even digital manipulation. All because my truck was too old and my grass too tall. Or rather, because I'd said no. Because I hadn't bowed. Friday arrived with news of the first domino falling. The tech guy she hired, username TechWizard999, got picked up by the feds on unrelated cybercrime charges. Facing time, he flipped fast. Gave them everything. Emails, payment records, even Lydia's voice recordings directing the forgery. I got the call from the U.S. Attorney's Office that afternoon. "Judge Harper, we'd like to move forward with charges against Ms. Bennett for wire fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to defraud a federal officer. Would you be willing to testify?" My answer was immediate. Yes, absolutely. That evening, the air smelled like justice. My phone buzzed with a final act of desperation. Lydia had sent a mass email to HOA members and press, claiming she had audio of me confessing to the crimes. She attached a file. Brandon and I listened to it together, and I'll be damned, it was AI-generated, pieced together from snippets of my court speeches and interviews, stilted and robotic. My voice allegedly saying things like, "Yes, I took the bribe. Thank you for the envelope." It would have been funny if it weren't so vile. But it proved one thing beyond doubt: she had nothing left. Just lies, panic, and noise. That night, I walked out to my gate. the rusted one she hated so much. The wild grass whispered around my boots, untouched and stubborn. I saw something taped to the post, a USB drive, with a note, "This isn't over, Harper." I turned it over in my hand, studying the handwriting. Same tight loops, same red ink. Lydia still thought she had a card to play. But what she didn't understand, what she never understood, was that when you try to destroy a man's name, his home, his dignity, and fail, you don't get another shot. You get judgment. You get consequence. I pocketed the drive and looked back at the house I'd built with bare hands and patience. She tried to strip me of it all, and she lost everything instead. The law was moving now. The machine was turning, and Lydia Bennett had just thrown herself under its wheels. Monday arrived with the weight of 1,000 unspoken reckonings. I dressed like I always did for federal court. Dark suit, simple tie, boots freshly shined. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because the act of preparation reminded me who I was and what I stood for. As I drove into Austin, the courthouse rising like a granite spine against the morning haze, I saw them. Reporters, cameras, curious bystanders all gathered like birds sensing a shift in the air. They weren't here for some celebrity scandal. They were here for the HOA president turned criminal who dared to frame a federal judge. Inside the courtroom, it was standing room only. Every face turned as I walked in, not with suspicion, but with expectation. My neighbors, fellow judges, people who'd watched the whole saga unfold from front lawns and online forums now sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see if the system would work the way it was supposed to. And then she appeared, Lydia Bennett, in her usual too-perfect getup, her expression a practiced mask of poise. But I saw it. The cracks around her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. Her lawyer looked like he hadn't slept in days. And I knew why. The evidence wasn't just strong. It was overwhelming. Prosecutor Jeanette Morrison laid it out with precision. Forged HOA signatures, including 3 from board members who hadn't lived in the community for years. Financial records tracing over $200,000 in embezzled funds routed to a landscaping company owned by Lydia's cousin. Emails coordinating digital forgeries. Audio files threatening neighbors. And of course, the cherry on top, an AI-generated deepfake of me accepting a bribe, so clumsy it had the courtroom murmuring with disbelief. But none of it hit harder than the testimony. Margaret Sullivan, hands trembling, recounted the threats Lydia had made to her and others. She told me if I didn't support her proposal to expand the HOA, she'd report my daughter's employer for hiring undocumented workers. Margaret said, voice cracking. My daughter's a nurse. There's nothing illegal about her job. But Lydia knew how to scare people. Other residents followed. Quiet men who'd been fined for paint that was one shade off. Elderly women who had cried over garden gnome citations. Parents whose kids were written up for chalk drawings. The common thread was fear. Intimidation disguised as regulation. Petty tyranny wrapped in the language of community standards. The moment that turned the room, though, was when Jennifer Walsh, a board member, took the stand. We found a stamp with Edith Ramsey's name, she said, holding up the physical evidence. Edith died in 2019. Her signature appears on documents through 2024. The judge leaned forward. Miss Walsh, are you suggesting these signatures were forged? She nodded. Not suggesting, confirming. Lydia used those stamps herself. I saw her do it. I watched Lydia's face as the truth surrounded her like a rising tide. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, but her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, darted once, twice, toward the exit. She knew the tide had turned, but the moment that sealed her fate wasn't from a witness. Came from her own mouth. Against her lawyer's advice, she demanded to testify. What followed was a masterclass in implosion. She claimed she'd only done what she did to protect property values, that she'd been unfairly targeted for caring too much. Someone had to maintain standards, she said, voice brittle. And Judge Harper, he was a threat. That truck, that grass, it sent the wrong message. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. So you fabricated evidence, falsified city complaints, hired a tech specialist to forge financial records, and created a fake video of a federal judge accepting bribes. All to protect community standards. Lydia hesitated, lips pressed into a line. He challenged my authority. I had to fight back. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the air leave the room. The jury didn't need deliberation. Their expressions had already written the verdict. When the judge read it, guilty on all counts. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, embezzlement, evidence tampering. Lydia stared straight ahead, face frozen in a mask of disbelief. But there was no out, no clause to wriggle through. She had built her HOA throne on a foundation of lies, and it collapsed under its own weight. As she was led out in cuffs, she passed me without a word. But the look she gave me wasn't hatred. It wasn't rage. It was emptiness. The look of someone who had spent so long believing their own delusions, they couldn't comprehend reality even as it dragged them away. Outside the courtroom, people gathered around. Some shook my hand. Others just nodded, grateful. Not because I'd won, but because someone had finally stood up. Because bullies only win when good people stay quiet. That evening, I returned to my ranch. The gate still rusted. The grass still wild. But now it was a monument, not an offense. A neighbor I barely knew drove by, rolled down his window and said, "Thanks for keeping it honest, Judge." I just nodded. I wasn't looking for praise. I was looking for peace. And maybe, just maybe, I'd found it, until I got home. Because taped to my door, bold as brass, was a second USB drive. No note, no name, just the unmistakable chill of unfinished business. I held it in my hand, the weight of it heavier than plastic should be. Lydia might have been locked up, but someone else still had a play to make. And I wasn't done fighting, not yet. The USB drive sat on my desk like a coiled rattlesnake, small and silent but pulsing with a threat I could feel in my chest. I stared at it for a full hour before I finally slid it into an isolated laptop I kept for sensitive files. One that had no connection to the internet and hadn't been powered on in months. The screen flickered. A folder appeared. Inside were a dozen video files and a single document titled "The Real Enemy." I clicked on the first video. Grainy security footage played. Parking lots, alleyways, a woman in a trench coat handing over a manila envelope to a man I didn't recognize. The next video was cleaner, sharper. Someone filming from inside a car, aiming the camera across the street toward what looked like my ranch gate. Then another, this one appeared to be drone footage, a slow, sweeping shot of my property, zooming in on license plates and doorways. My heart rate didn't spike. It settled. I'd seen intimidation before, but this wasn't Lydia's style. This was colder, systematic. I opened the document. It read like a manifesto. Whoever had written it, an anonymous source claiming to be a former HOA administrator from another district, laid out a network of HOAs across the state, allegedly connected by shadow finances, shared legal consultants, and a pattern of manipulating zoning laws for personal profit. Lydia, it said, wasn't the queen. She was a rook, a pawn moved by bigger players with deeper pockets. And when she fell, she triggered alarms. I sat back, rubbing my temples. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, a hoax. But the videos were real. The detail, the structure, it felt too intentional. I printed everything and locked it in my safe. The next morning, I called Brandon. "You remember that note on the first USB?" I asked. "This isn't over?" He exhaled hard through the line. "Yeah." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. By noon, he'd confirmed the drone footage came from a registered service in San Marcos, hired under a fake HOA address, paid in cash. Untraceable, except the payment was processed through a shell company that had appeared in the HOA's own expense ledger 4 months earlier. We'd missed it during the first audit. Brandon found more. False permit requests filed in my name, zoning board inquiries into my ranch, flagged under potential redevelopment opportunity. Someone was trying to make a case for eminent domain. I spent that night on the porch, coffee gone cold in my hand, eyes scanning the horizon like I used to in Afghanistan. Not for enemies, but for patterns, small things out of place, shifts in the familiar. 2:14 a.m. I saw it. A car idling by the far fence line, lights off. I didn't move, just memorized the shape. Brandon traced it the next morning, registered to a law firm in Dallas known for representing HOA conglomerates. We were through the looking glass now. I called a friend at the state attorney general's office. "You ever hear of HOA clusters coordinating property development?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Not officially." That meant yes. A soft yes. A dangerous yes. Over the next week, things escalated. A local paper ran an anonymous editorial calling for increased oversight of rural properties in transition zones. An obvious jab at my land. A zoning request was filed to pave a new access road right through my west pasture. The signature? A name that didn't exist, backed by a company that had filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago. This wasn't about grass or fences. This was about money, development, land grabbing under the guise of compliance. And someone thought they could roll over an old judge with a pickup and some rusted tools. They were wrong. I went public, released the drone footage, called a press conference, shared Lydia's entire fraud file and hinted at the deeper network. HOAs are not inherently bad, I said into the cameras, but unchecked power in the wrong hands? That's how you get tyranny, one lawn violation at a time. The story exploded. Local stations picked it up, then national. Retired veterans, longtime farmers, elderly homeowners began sharing their stories. Fines for flags, evictions over mailbox height, lawsuits for garden choices. A state representative reached out quietly. "This might be bigger than we thought," she said. "We're forming a task force. I want you on it." That same night, someone broke into my property, cut the gate lock, slashed my truck tires, left a dead crow on my porch. Brandon took one look and said, "They're trying to scare you off the story." I laughed, dry and low. They should have checked my resume. We installed cameras, motion lights. I filed a federal injunction against unauthorized HOA surveillance. Then I went to court, again. But this time I wasn't just defending my ranch. I was testifying before a state oversight panel, naming names, showing files, and every document I handed over was another brick in the wall closing in on them. The night before the final hearing, I sat with Margaret on my porch. She poured tea. I took bourbon. "I used to be afraid," she said, staring at the horizon. "But watching you fight, it reminded me we still get to say no." I nodded. That's all it takes. One no loud enough to break their spell. The panel ruled unanimously. The zoning request was denied. The false permit flagged for criminal investigation. And the so-called development consortium was subpoenaed for financial disclosures. One by one, the players behind the curtain began to blink. And Lydia? She sent one last letter. Handwritten. Rambling. "I was just trying to fit in," she wrote. "To be someone. I thought if I controlled everything, nothing could fall apart." I folded the letter and set it on the fire pit. Watched it curl and blacken. Control isn't safety. It's just another kind of prison. A month later, I stood at the edge of my ranch, watching my new fence go up. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. It was cedar. Simple. Strong. Behind me, my old truck gleamed under a fresh coat of wax. Still loud. Still ugly. Still mine. Lydia's HOA was gone. The cluster behind her was unraveling. And the gate, still black, still honest, stood tall. Unapologetic. They'd tried to break me with bureaucracy, with fear, with lies. But what they didn't understand was that men like me, we don't flinch. We don't fold. We remember. We resist. And when push comes to shove, we fight. Because peace isn't just the absence of noise. It's the presence of justice. And I'd earned mine, inch by inch, fight by fight. Not just for me, but for everyone who ever got fined for living free.